Pisaster Ochraceus. It's pretty much just a sea star. It's known as the Ochre sea star. Ochre is just like kind of a special term to refer to orange. And it's also known as the purple sea star. Most commonly, they're purple, although they can be orange and reddish brown. And scientists aren't really sort of aware about why they're different colors. They think it might be related to diet. So Pisaster is located so they're located on the Pacific coast of the United States, from Alaska all the way to Baja California. So really long stretch of coastline. They occupy the intertidal zones. So that's the area between the high and low tides, and they're in the low to mid range. And so that can often encompass like tide pools. So if you look at the bottom image, that kind of illustrates a nice tide pool with some of those sea stars. And so because they're between the tides, they both are exposed to air and they're exposed to water. So Pisaster is a keystone species. In fact, it's literally the original keystone species. Robert Payne, who's the guy who invented the term and the concept of keystone species, was doing what made it when he was studying Pisaster Ochraceus and its relation to Mytilus californianus, which is basically a type of mussel. Basically, what the sea stars do is that they eat a lot of mussels, and basically they're a check on the mussel population. When you remove all of the sea stars, then basically the mussel population explodes, and because they're so good at taking up space, they take up all of the space from other species in that sort of zone and from the rocky, kind of rocky cliffs. And basically because of that, what happens with Pisaster affects tons of different animals, and reducing it has empirically reduced the diversity of the area. So as mentioned, they prey on mussels, but they also prey on like snails, barnacles, chitons, limpets. It's actually interesting how they eat, just kind of as a brief side note. You can kind of see it here, but basically what they do is they use their tube feet to open up some of the sides of the mussel, and then they take their stomach, they take it out of their body and turn it inside out, and they stick it into the crevice of the mussel, and then like sort of emit digestive fluid and basically eat the mussel. And that's just like really strange, pretty cool. And then finally for predation, they're not really that many predators. There are otters and seagulls, but even then, those only sometimes eat Pisaster. So abiotic factors. There's temperature, as we'll see in a minute or so. There isn't really consensus, but both really high and really low temperatures can hurt Pisaster. Low oxygenation can also harm it. And finally, salinity has a really strong impact on growth. And they're usually banded in a small low salinity ratio. They're osmoconformers, I believe. So the big thing about Pisaster is sea star wasting disease. It's a new phenomenon, and it's a result of the sea star associated densovirus. The symptoms are lesions on the outside, then the sea star fragments, so parts of its tube feet break off, and then it dies. So there was a really big outbreak of this on the West Coast from 2013 to 2015. There was a really large die out. Ultimately, younger sea stars filled in, but during that but still, as the population's gone down, other sea stars like Troschel sea star have grown because they're less affected by the disease. So it can kind of show that competition over the niche. But basically climate change. What is the effect on climate change? There's actually a big scientific debate about it. As this excerpt from the Scheibelhut paper shows, there is a debate about whether elevated temperature or reduced temperature can impact growth rates and positive elements. So there is a consensus that climate change will increase temperature and CO2 concentration, but there's a disagreement on whether or not it will increase growth rates. So the Gooding et al. Paper published in the Proceedings for the National Academy of Sciences, which is a peer-reviewed paper, found that temperature increases have a linear correlation with increasing both relative growth rates and feeding rates. And this was sort of done in a lab. They also found that CO2 increases also increase the growth rate. And this examination of CO2, as far as I can tell, has been a unique examination. Ultimately, as you can see in the bottom graph, which shows the sort of statistical significance and the standard error bars, you can see how combinations of higher temperatures and higher concentrations of CO2 are correlated with higher feeding rates and higher growth rates. So the other side of this, however, is that there's this Bates et al. Study and some other studies published in the Disease of Aquatic Organisms peer-reviewed journal that actually found that temperature increases could cause mass mortalities of pisaster due to wasting diseases. So they both tested in the lab and the field, and they focused on that sea star wasting disease and found that when you increase the temperature, there's a big increase in the prevalence of sea star wasting disease and an increase in how fast it can proceed. So there's kind of a difference. The earlier study focused on an increase in growth rates, but this one focused on disease. So there's still a big scientific debate about whether it'll help or harm the sea star. However, there is a consensus that climate change will hurt the mussels that the sea star would eat, so it probably does have a negative impact in that way. Finally, conservation. Sea stars are not endangered. But what scientists do is they have these index sites that they do where they check for sea star wasting disease, and using that data, they track how it's been progressing. Using this method, they caught the first big outbreak in Washington state of sea star wasting disease, and they've been using it to analyze causes and abiotic factors. And all that data is still coming in, so that explains the big scientific debate about what is actually causing sea star wasting disease. So that was my presentation. I have different citations, so for the paper, for some of the images that weren't graphs, and then for the background of ecology. And all of the graphs were taken from the papers and were originally created by the papers.